In 1903, in the heart of Edinburgh, a wedding meant to unite two families ended in a silence so complete that only one voice remained to tell it. Viewers are invited to share which country or state they are listening from. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Edinburgh at the turn of the 20th century was a city of contrasts, where the old stone of medieval closes pressed up against the new ambitions of the modern age. The castle loomed over the city, its silhouette etched against a sky that was often gray, sometimes golden, and always restless. The streets below bustled with the clatter of horse-drawn carriages and the steady footfall of a people accustomed to both hardship and celebration. Gaslights flickered to life as dusk fell, casting long shadows across the cobblestones and lending a gentle glow to the faces of those who hurried home or lingered in the warmth of public houses. It was in this city, with its ancient spires and winding winds, that the families of McAllister and Drummond prepared for a union that promised to bring not only joy, but also a sense of renewal. The McAllisters, respected merchants with a shop on Princes Street, had long been known for their generosity and their pride in tradition. The Drummonds, a family of scholars and minor nobility, brought with them a lineage that stretched back to the days of Mary, Queen of Scots. Their children, Fiona McAllister and Andrew Drummond, had met at a charity ball the previous winter, their courtship marked by gentle walks along the water of Leith and evenings spent in the glow of drawing-room fires. The wedding was to be a grand affair, the kind that would be spoken of for years to come. Invitations were sent to every corner of the city, and even as far as Glasgow and Aberdeen. The ceremony would take place at St. Giles Cathedral, its great stone nave echoing with the sound of organ music and the soft murmur of anticipation. The reception, to be held in the McAllister townhouse on Harriet Row, promised a feast of the finest Scottish fare: roast beef and salmon, oatcakes and cheeses, and a table heavy with sweetmeats and whiskey. On the morning of the wedding, Edinburgh awoke to a sky washed clean by rain. The air was sharp and bracing, carrying the scent of wet earth and distant sea. Carriages arrived in procession, their wheels rattling over the stones, as guests in their finest tartan and lace stepped out beneath the watchful gaze of neighbors and passers-by. The bride, Fiona, was radiant in a gown of ivory silk, her hair pinned with sprigs of heather and her cheeks flushed with excitement. Andrew, tall and earnest, wore his family's tartan with pride, his eyes never straying far from his bride. Inside the cathedral, the air was cool and still, the only sound the soft shuffle of feet and the occasional cough muffled by stone. Candles flickered in their sconces, casting a golden light on the faces of the assembled guests. The minister, his voice steady and warm, spoke of love and duty, of the joining of two houses and the promise of a future built on trust. The vows were exchanged with trembling hands and shining eyes, and when the couple turned to face their friends and family, the applause was genuine and heartfelt. Outside, the bells of St. Giles rang out across the city, their peal echoing down the Royal Mile and out over the rooftops. The newlyweds emerged to a shower of rose petals and the cheers of well-wishers. The procession made its way through the city, the bride and groom waving from their carriage as children ran alongside, their laughter rising above the clatter of hooves. At the McAllister home, the reception was already underway. The drawing rooms were filled with the scent of fresh flowers and the sound of music, a quartet playing reels and waltzes as guests mingled and exchanged stories. The tables groaned under the weight of food and drink, and the servants moved quietly among the guests, refilling glasses and offering trays of delicacies. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the windows steamed with the warmth of so many bodies gathered together. Toasts were raised to the health of the bride and groom, to the prosperity of their families, and to the city of Edinburgh itself. The whiskey flowed freely, its peaty aroma mingling with the sweetness of sherry and the sharp tang of cider. Laughter rang out as old friends reunited and new acquaintances were made. The bride's father, his voice thick with emotion, spoke of the joy of seeing his daughter so happy, and the groom's mother dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief as she welcomed Fiona into the Drummond clan. As the evening wore on, the city outside seemed to fade away, the world reduced to the golden glow of gaslight and the gentle hum of conversation. The bride and groom danced their first reel, their steps light and sure, and the guests joined in, the floorboards trembling beneath the weight of so much celebration. The air was thick with the promise of new beginnings, and for a moment, it seemed as if nothing could disturb the happiness that filled the house. But beneath the laughter and the music, beneath the clink of glasses and the rustle of silk, there was a tension that no one could name. It lingered in the corners of the room, in the flicker of candlelight and the sudden hush that fell when the wind rattled the windows. It was the kind of unease that comes before a storm, a sense that the world is holding its breath. As midnight approached, the guests gathered for the final toast, their glasses raised high in the flickering light. The bride and groom stood side by side, their hands entwined, as the minister offered a blessing for their future. The guests drank deeply, their voices rising in a final chorus of good wishes. No one could have known that before the night was over, the joy of the Hemlock Wedding would be replaced by a silence so profound that only one voice would remain to tell the tale. The reception at the McAllister townhouse unfolded with all the warmth and grandeur that Edinburgh society could muster. The rooms glowed with the soft light of gas lamps, their glass chimneys fogged by the breath of so many guests. The air was thick with the mingled scents of beeswax, peat smoke, and the delicate perfume of hothouse flowers arranged in every corner. Laughter and music spilled out into the hallway, where servants in crisp uniforms hurried to and fro, balancing silver trays laden with oatcakes, smoked salmon, and sugared almonds. In the main dining room, the long table was set with the finest McAllister china, each place marked by a sprig of heather tied with tartan ribbon. The wedding cake, a towering confection of fruit and marzipan, stood at the head of the table, its white icing gleaming in the candlelight. Guests found their seats, their cheeks flushed from dancing and drink, and the hum of conversation rose and fell like the tide. The meal itself was a celebration of Scottish abundance. There was cock-a-leekie soup, rich and steaming, followed by platters of roast beef and salmon, their juices pooling on willow-patterned plates. Bowls of neeps and tatties, buttery and golden, were passed from hand to hand. The wine flowed freely, and the whiskey, bottled from the Drummond family's own casks, was poured with a generous hand. Toasts were made to the bride and groom, to the health of the families, to the city, and to the future. Andrew Drummond, the groom, stood to thank the guests, his voice steady, but his eyes shining with emotion. He spoke of his love for Fiona, of the kindness shown by her family, and of the hope that their union would bring peace and prosperity to both houses. Fiona, her hand resting lightly on his arm, smiled at her new husband, her eyes bright with happiness and perhaps a touch of nerves. As the meal drew to a close, the guests rose for the traditional Sealy. The quartet struck up a lively reel, and the floorboards trembled beneath the stamping feet of dancers. The bride's gown swirled as she spun, her laughter ringing out above the music. The groom, flushed with exertion and whiskey, led his mother in a stately waltz. The older guests watched from the sidelines, their faces softened by memory and the glow of the fire. It was nearly midnight when the minister called for the final toast. The guests gathered in the drawing room, glasses filled with a special punch prepared for the occasion, a blend of whiskey, lemon, and a secret ingredient known only to the McAllister matriarch. The bride and groom stood at the center of the room, their hands entwined, as the minister raised his glass and offered a blessing for their future. The guests echoed the toast, their voices rising in a chorus of good wishes. Glasses clinked and the punch was sipped with relish. For a moment, the world seemed suspended in a golden haze of happiness and hope. But as the laughter faded and the music slowed, a subtle change crept into the room. It began with a single cough, sharp and unexpected, followed by another and another. A guest at the far end of the table pressed a hand to his lips, his face suddenly pale. Another stumbled, her glass slipping from her fingers and shattering on the hearth. The air, so recently filled with joy, grew heavy and uncertain. One by one, the guests began to falter. Some clutched at their throats, their voices failing as they tried to call for help. Others slumped in their chairs, their faces drained of color, their lips darkening to a strange, unnatural hue. The servants, at first confused, rushed to their aid, but soon they too were overcome, their trays crashing to the floor as they collapsed. Panic spread through the house like wildfire. The music ceased, the laughter died, and the only sound was the desperate gasping of those who struggled to breathe. The bride, standing at the center of the chaos, looked around in horror as her new husband fell to his knees beside her, his hand reaching for hers, before slipping away. Within minutes, the grand celebration had become a scene of confusion and terror. The McAllister matriarch, her face ashen, tried to call for a doctor, but her voice failed her. The Drummond patriarch, once so proud and dignified, slumped against the wall, his eyes wide with disbelief. The guests, so recently united in joy, now lay scattered across the floor, their bodies still and silent. Outside, the city of Edinburgh slept on, unaware of the tragedy unfolding behind the elegant facade of the McAllister home. The gaslights flickered in the mist, and the bells of St. Giles's tolled the hour, their echo lost in the night. By the time the first doctor arrived, summoned by a frantic neighbor, the house was eerily quiet. The air was thick with the scent of spilled wine and something sharper, more bitter. The doctor moved from room to room, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpets, his face growing grimmer with each new discovery. Of the dozens who had gathered to celebrate, only the bride remained standing, her gown stained and her eyes hollow with shock. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of bells and the soft sobbing of the bride as she knelt beside her husband's body. The Hemlock Wedding, as it would come to be known, had claimed 36 lives in a single night, leaving only one voice to tell the tale. Dawn crept slowly over Edinburgh, the city's ancient stones glistening with dew as the first rays of sunlight filtered through a veil of mist. The McAllister townhouse, once a beacon of celebration, now stood silent and shuttered, its windows dark against the pale morning. Word of the disaster spread quickly, carried by servants and neighbors, and by mid-morning a crowd had gathered outside, their breath clouding in the chill air as they waited for news. Inside, the scene was one of devastation. The grand rooms, so recently filled with laughter and music, were now hushed and heavy with grief. The bodies of the guests lay where they had fallen, their faces marked by the strange dark hue that had overtaken them in their final moments. The scent of flowers and spilled wine mingled with something bitter and unfamiliar, a sharpness that lingered in the air and clung to the curtains and carpets. Doctors and constables moved quietly through the house, their voices low and urgent. They examined the fallen, searching for any sign of life, but found only silence. The bride, Fiona, sat alone in the drawing room, her wedding gown stained and her hands trembling in her lap. Her eyes, red-rimmed and hollow, stared at nothing as she answered the questions put to her by the authorities. It was Fiona's statement that would become the first thread in the tangled web of the Hemlock Wedding. She spoke softly, her voice barely more than a whisper, recounting the events of the night. She remembered the laughter, the music, the taste of the punch, and the sudden, terrible change that swept through the room. She described how her new husband had collapsed at her feet, how her friends and family had fallen silent one by one, and how she alone had remained untouched. When asked how she had survived, Fiona hesitated. She explained that, during the final toast, she had been handed a different cup, one set aside for the bride, adorned with a sprig of heather and a silver rim. She had sipped only a little, distracted by the press of well-wishers and the swirl of her own thoughts. The cup, she said, had tasted of nothing but whiskey and lemon, and she had set it aside before the toast was finished. The authorities listened carefully, noting every detail. The cup was found and set aside for examination, its surface still marked by the bride's lipstick and the faint scent of whiskey. The punch bowl, now nearly empty, was collected as evidence, along with the glasses and the remains of the wedding feast. The doctors, their faces grave, began the slow work of examining the bodies, searching for any clue that might explain the sudden and devastating loss of life. Outside, the city was abuzz with rumor and speculation. The press arrived in force, their notebooks ready to record every detail, every whispered theory. The story of the Hemlock Wedding spread quickly, its details growing more dramatic with each retelling. Some spoke of a curse, others of a vengeful spirit, and still others of a terrible accident. The truth, as always, was more elusive. The police, led by Inspector James Calder, began their investigation with methodical precision. They interviewed the surviving servants, the musicians, and the staff who had prepared the food and drink. They examined the kitchen, the pantry, and the cellars, searching for any sign of tampering or foul play. The punch bowl, the glasses, and the bride's special cup were sent to the university for chemical analysis, their contents carefully preserved. As the day wore on, the scale of the tragedy became clear. 36 guests had perished, including both families' patriarchs and matriarchs, friends from as far as Aberdeen, and even the minister who had blessed the union. Only the bride remained, her survival a mystery that deepened the sense of unease that hung over the city. The funerals began almost at once, the bells of St. Giles tolling day after day as the city mourned its dead. Black-clad mourners filed through the streets, their faces drawn and pale, their eyes fixed on the ground. The McAllister and Drummond names, once spoken with pride, were now whispered in sorrow and fear. The city's newspapers printed lists of the dead, their columns bordered in black, and the story of the Hemlock Wedding became the talk of every close-in wind. In the days that followed, the investigation continued. The university's chemists worked late into the night, their laboratories filled with the sharp scent of reagents and the soft clink of glassware. They tested the punch, the wine, and the remains of the wedding feast, searching for any trace of poison. The results, when they came, were both shocking and strangely familiar. The chemists identified the presence of coniine, a deadly alkaloid found in the hemlock plant. The poison, they explained, was swift and merciless, attacking the nervous system and causing paralysis, suffocation, and death. It was the same poison that had claimed the life of Socrates in ancient Athens, and its use in medicine and execution was well documented in the annals of history. But how it had come to be present in the punch bowl of a wedding in Edinburgh was a question that no one could answer. The city, already gripped by fear, now found itself in the throes of suspicion. Rumors spread of old feuds, of jealous rivals, of secrets buried beneath the surface of polite society. The bride, once the object of envy and admiration, became a figure of fascination and dread. Some whispered that she had been the intended target, others that she was the perpetrator, and still others that she was simply the last lonely witness to a tragedy that defied explanation. As the days turned to weeks, the Hemlock Wedding cast a long shadow over Edinburgh. The city's ancient stones seemed to hold their breath, waiting for answers that would never fully come. And in the quiet of her empty house, the bride sat alone, her voice the only one left to tell the tale of a day that had begun in joy and ended in silence. The city of Edinburgh, so often stoic in the face of hardship, found itself unsettled in the wake of the Hemlock Wedding. The tragedy was discussed in every corner of the city, from the grand salons of Newtown to the smoky taprooms of the Old Town. The air itself seemed colder, the gaslights dimmer, as if the city's very spirit had been dampened by the weight of so much loss. Inspector Calder, a man known for his patience and thoroughness, pressed on with the investigation. He walked the cobbled streets from dawn until dusk, his boots echoing in the closes as he visited every shop and apothecary that might have sold hemlock or its extracts. He questioned the grocers who had supplied the wedding feast, the wine merchants who had delivered the casks, and the confectioners who had prepared the sugared almonds. Each denied any knowledge of poison, their records and reputations offered up for scrutiny. The servants, still shaken by the events of that night, were interviewed again and again. They described the preparation of the punch, the careful washing of the bride's special cup, the bustle of the kitchen as the final dishes were plated. None recalled anything unusual. No strange visitors, no unfamiliar bottles, no hint of malice. The musicians, who had left before the final toast, could only speak of the joy and laughter that had filled the house. Yet the evidence was clear. The punch, so eagerly consumed by the guests, had been laced with a fatal dose of hemlock. The chemists at the university confirmed the presence of conine in the dregs of the bowl and in the glasses collected from the scene. The poison had been expertly mixed, its bitter taste masked by the sweetness of lemon and whiskey. It was, the experts agreed, the work of someone with knowledge and intent. The city's newspapers seized upon every detail, their headlines growing more lurid with each edition. "Death at the altar," proclaimed one. "A bride alone," declared another. The press speculated wildly. Was it a case of mistaken identity, a vendetta against one of the families, or a crime of passion gone horribly awry? Theories abounded, each more sensational than the last. The bride, Fiona, became the focus of both sympathy and suspicion. She was seen only rarely, her face veiled, and her steps hurried as she moved between her home and the offices of the authorities. Some pitied her, imagining the horror of surviving such a night. Others whispered that her survival was too convenient, that her statement about the special cup was rehearsed, that she had more to gain from the deaths than she let on. Inspector Calder, for his part, found no evidence to support these rumors. Fiona's grief was genuine, her answers consistent, her actions in the aftermath those of a woman in shock. Yet the absence of any other suspect, the lack of motive, and the sheer scale of the tragedy left the city restless and unsatisfied. The investigation turned to the history of hemlock itself. In Scotland, the plant was both feared and respected. It grew wild in the meadows and along the riverbanks, its delicate white flowers belying its deadly nature. In ancient times, it had been used as a medicine, a sedative for the dying, a last resort for those in unbearable pain. But it was also the poison of executioners, the tool of those who wished to silence their enemies without bloodshed. The chemists explained how easily hemlock could be prepared. Its leaves and seeds crushed, its essence distilled into a clear, odorless liquid. In the wrong hands, it was a weapon as silent as it was effective. The city's apothecaries, when questioned, insisted that they kept their stocks locked and accounted for. But Calder knew that a determined individual could find what they needed in the wild or on the black market. Rumors of old feuds and hidden resentments began to surface. The McAllisters, for all their generosity, had made enemies in business. The Drummonds, with their proud lineage, had been the subject of jealousy and gossip. Some whispered of a dismissed servant, others of a jilted lover, still others of a rival merchant who had lost everything to the McAllisters' success. The city's gossips wove these threads into a tapestry of suspicion, each theory more elaborate than the last. Yet for all the speculation, the investigation found no clear suspect. The punch had been prepared in the open, the ingredients delivered by trusted suppliers, the glasses filled and passed by the hands of many. The bride's special cup, set aside by tradition, had spared her life, but it offered no clue as to the identity of the poisoner. As the days passed, the city's grief turned to unease. The funerals, held in quick succession, drew crowds of mourners who stood in the cold, their breath rising in the frosty air as the bells of St. Giles tolled again and again. The minister spoke of fate and forgiveness, of the fragility of life and the need for vigilance. The coffins, draped in tartan and heather, were lowered into the earth, their weight a burden shared by all of Edinburgh. The McAllister townhouse, once the scene of so much joy, was shuttered and silent. The Drummond estate, its windows dark, seemed to shrink from the world. The city's social calendar, so recently filled with balls and gatherings, was suddenly empty. The Hemlock Wedding had cast a pall over Edinburgh, a shadow that would not lift. Inspector Calder, his investigation stalled, returned again and again to the evidence. He walked the empty rooms of the McAllister home, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He studied the chemist's reports, the statements of the servants, the lists of guests and suppliers. Each clue led only to more questions. Each answer dissolved into uncertainty. And all the while, the city waited, its heart heavy with suspicion and sorrow. its breath held for a resolution that seemed always just out of reach. The days after the funerals were marked by a strange quiet in Edinburgh, as if the city itself was in mourning. The wind off the Firth of Forth seemed colder, the cries of the gulls sharper, and the gaslights along Princes Street flickered in the dusk as if reluctant to illuminate the shadows that now haunted every corner. The Hemlock Wedding had become more than a tragedy. It was a riddle that gnawed at the city's sense of order and safety. Inspector Calder, his brow furrowed and his coat collar turned up against the chill, continued his rounds. He visited the university's library, poring over old texts on poisons and their uses. Hemlock, he learned, had a long and infamous history in Scotland. It was the plant that had ended the lives of ancient philosophers and condemned criminals alike. In the Highlands, it was whispered that hemlock could be used to settle feuds when the sword was too blunt or the law too slow. Its presence in the wedding punch was both a signature and a warning, a message written in the language of death. The inspector's inquiries took him to the city's apothecaries and herbalists, men and women who knew the secrets of plants and their powers. Most were cautious, their eyes wary as they spoke of hemlock's dangers. A few admitted to keeping small amounts for medicinal purposes, but all insisted their stocks were accounted for. Calder pressed them for names. Anyone who had asked unusual questions, anyone who had shown too much interest in the plant. The answers were always the same. No one. Nothing. A city too busy for such old-world poisons. Yet the inspector was not convinced. He walked the meadows at the city's edge, his boots sinking into the damp earth, his eyes searching for the telltale fronds of the hemlock plant. It grew in abundance, its white flowers nodding in the breeze, its roots hidden deep in the soil. Anyone with knowledge and patience could gather enough to kill a roomful of guests. The thought chilled Calder more than the wind ever could. Meanwhile, the city's obsession with the case grew. The newspapers published daily updates, their columns filled with speculation and rumor. Artists sketched the bride's pale face, her eyes haunted and distant, and sold the likenesses on street corners. Poets wrote verses about love and death, about a wedding turned to wake, about a bride left alone in a house of ghosts. The Hemlock Wedding became a symbol, a story retold in every pub and parlor, its details shifting with each telling. Theories multiplied. Some insisted the poison was meant for the bride, that a jealous rival or spurned lover had sought to ruin her happiness. Others believed the target was the groom, or perhaps both families, their union a threat to some hidden enemy. A few whispered of old curses, of wrongs done generations before, of debts paid in blood and silence. The city's imagination, always fertile, found endless ways to explain the inexplicable. Inspector Calder, for all his skepticism, could not ignore the possibility of sabotage. He revisited the guest list, searching for anyone with a grudge or a secret. He questioned the servants again, pressing them for memories of strange faces or odd behavior. He examined the kitchen, the pantry, the cellars, looking for any sign of tampering. But the evidence remained stubbornly elusive. The punch had been prepared in the open, the ingredients delivered by trusted hands, the glasses filled and passed among friends. The only anomaly remained the bride's cup, a tradition in some Scottish weddings, a vessel set aside for the bride alone, adorned with heather and silver. Fiona's statement was clear. She had sipped only a little, distracted by the press of guests, and had set the cup aside before the toast was finished. The cup itself, when tested, showed only the faintest trace of hemlock, far less than the lethal dose found in the punch bowl. It was, the chemists agreed, enough to explain her survival, but not enough to point to a deliberate act of mercy or malice. The city's suspicion, unable to find a target, began to turn inward. Families who had once celebrated together now eyed each other with mistrust. Old quarrels resurfaced and new ones were born. The McAllister and Drummond names, once spoken with pride, became a source of discomfort. The bride, Fiona, became a figure of myth and rumor. Some saw her as a tragic survivor, others as a woman marked by fate, and a few as something more sinister. As the investigation dragged on, Calder found himself haunted by the case. He dreamed of the wedding feast, the laughter turning to silence, the faces of the dead staring up at him from the candlelit tables. He saw the bride alone in her gown, her eyes fixed on something only she could see. He woke in the night to the sound of bells, their echo lingering long after the dream had faded. The city, too, was restless. The Hemlock Wedding had become a wound that would not heal, a question that would not be answered. The gaslights flickered in the mist, the bells of St. Giles's tolled for the lost, and the people of Edinburgh waited for justice, or at least for understanding. But as the days turned to weeks, and the weeks to months, it became clear that some mysteries are too deeply rooted to be unearthed by reason alone. The hemlock, with its delicate flowers and deadly heart, had claimed its place in the city's history. The wedding that was meant to unite two families had instead left a legacy of suspicion, sorrow, and silence. And in the heart of it all, the bride remained, her story unfinished, her fate entwined with the city's own, as Edinburgh struggled to make sense of a day when joy turned to ash and a single cup decided the line between life and death. As the weeks slipped by, the Hemlock Wedding became more than a tragedy. It became a mirror for Edinburgh's own anxieties and ambitions. The city, with its proud stone facades and ancient traditions, was a place where secrets could linger for generations, and where every family had its share of old wounds. The silence left by the wedding's aftermath was filled with speculation, and the story grew with every retelling. Rumors of sabotage took root in the city's imagination. Some whispered that the poison had been meant for the McAllisters alone, a final act in a business rivalry that had simmered for years. The McAllisters, after all, had prospered while others had failed, and their success had not come without cost. There were tales of ruined competitors, of debts unpaid, of promises broken in the shadowed back rooms of Edinburgh's mercantile quarter. The Drummonds, too, were not without enemies. Their lineage was old, their pride well known, and their alliances had shifted with the tides of politics and fortune. Inspector Calder, aware of these undercurrents, delved into the histories of both families. He pored over legal documents, business ledgers, and private correspondence, searching for any hint of a feud that might have led to such a calculated act. He found disputes over land, arguments over contracts, and the faint traces of old resentments, but nothing that pointed directly to murder. The rivalries were real, but they were the rivalries of a city. Sharp, sometimes bitter, but rarely fatal. Yet the city's appetite for scandal was insatiable. The press published stories of secret meetings and shadowy figures seen near the McAllister home in the days before the wedding. Anonymous letters arrived at the police station, each claiming to know the truth, each pointing a finger at a different suspect. Some accused a dismissed servant, others a jealous cousin, still others a business partner ruined by the family's union. The inspector followed each lead, but every path ended in rumor and innuendo. The possibility of intentional targeting of the wedding party became a favorite subject in the city's drawing rooms. Some speculated that the poisoner had intended to strike at the heart of Edinburgh society, to send a message that no one, not even the city's most respected families, was safe. Others believed the act was personal, a crime of passion or revenge, its motive hidden in the tangled web of love and loyalty that bound the guests together. The bride, Fiona, remained at the center of the storm. Her survival was both a comfort and a source of suspicion. She was seen less and less, her appearances marked by a quiet dignity that only deepened the city's fascination. Some said she was haunted by what she had witnessed, others that she was hiding something. A few, emboldened by the anonymity of gossip, suggested that she had played a role in the tragedy, that her statement about the special cup was too convenient, her grief too composed. Inspector Calder, for all his doubts, found no evidence to support these suspicions. Fiona's life before the wedding had been unremarkable, her friendship steady, her reputation unblemished. Her relationship with Andrew Drummond had been the subject of admiration, not scandal. The inspector interviewed her again and again, searching for inconsistencies, but her story never changed. She had sipped from her cup, distracted by the press of guests, and set it aside. She had watched in horror as her new husband and her family collapsed around her. She had survived, but she had lost everything. The city's obsession with the case only grew as the months passed. The Hemlock Wedding became a touchstone for every anxiety, every fear of betrayal or loss. The story was told in whispers at bedtime, in warnings to daughters about the dangers of envy and ambition, in sermons about the fragility of life. The McAllister townhouse, once a symbol of prosperity, stood empty and shuttered, its windows dark against the evening sky. The Drummond estate, too, seemed to shrink from the world, its gates closed to all but the most trusted visitors. The investigation, for all its thoroughness, could not pierce the veil of secrecy that had settled over the city. The punch bowl, the glasses, the bride's cup, all had been examined and re-examined, their contents tested and retested. The chemists confirmed the presence of hemlock, but could not say how or when it had been added. The servants, the suppliers, the guests, none could recall anything unusual. The evidence was as silent as the house itself. As the first anniversary of the wedding approached, the city's grief began to harden into legend. The Hemlock Wedding was no longer just a crime. It was a story, a warning, a shadow that lingered in the corners of every celebration. The bells of St. Giles's tolled for the lost, and the city's poets wrote of love turned to ash, of joy poisoned by secrets, of a bride left alone in a world that could not understand her sorrow. And then, on a morning as cold and clear as the day of the wedding itself, the city awoke to a new mystery. The bride, Fiona, had vanished. Her room was empty, her belongings undisturbed, her wedding dress draped over the iron gate of St. Giles's as if left as an offering or a farewell. No note was found, no witness came forward. She was simply gone, leaving behind only questions and the echo of her absence. The city was stunned. Some believed she had taken her own life, unable to bear the weight of her loss. Others thought she had fled to the highlands, or perhaps to the continent, seeking a place where her name was not known. A few whispered that she had been taken by those who wished to silence her, or that she had chosen to disappear, to become a ghost in her own story. Inspector Calder searched for her, but found no trace. The city's last link to the Hemlock Wedding had slipped away, leaving only silence and the memory of a day when joy and death had walked hand in hand through the heart of Edinburgh. The disappearance of Fiona McAllister, the last living witness to the Hemlock Wedding, sent a fresh tremor through Edinburgh's already shaken heart. The city awoke to the news with a sense of disbelief, as if the final act of a tragedy had played out in silence while the world slept. The image of her wedding dress, pale and spectral against the black iron of the church gate, lingered in the minds of all who passed by St. Giles's that morning. It was as if the city itself had been left at the altar, abandoned and bewildered. Inspector Calder, weary from months of fruitless investigation, found himself once again at the center of a storm of speculation. He retraced his steps through the empty McAllister townhouse, its rooms still heavy with the scent of old flowers and the faint, bitter tang of hemlock. He questioned the few remaining servants, but they could offer nothing new. No sign of a struggle, no hurried packing, no word of a destination. Fiona's personal effects remained untouched, her jewelry and letters neatly arranged on her dressing table, her shoes lined up by the door as if waiting for her return. The city's newspapers seized upon the story, their headlines bold and breathless. "Bride vanishes. Hemlock curse strikes again," they proclaimed, and the public devoured every detail. Some writers speculated that Fiona had been driven mad by grief, her mind unraveling under the weight of so much loss. Others suggested she had been spirited away by a secret lover, or that she had fled to escape the relentless scrutiny of a city that could not let her mourn in peace. A few, their imaginations fired by the darkness of the tale, whispered that she had been claimed by the same fate that had taken her family and friends, that the Hemlock Wedding had demanded one final sacrifice. In the absence of answers, the city turned to ritual and remembrance. A candlelit vigil was held outside St. Giles's, mourners gathering in the cold to pray for the lost and the missing. The bells tolled once more, their sound echoing through the winds and closes, a reminder of all that had been taken. The ministers spoke of forgiveness and hope, but their words seemed small against the enormity of the tragedy. The McAllister and Drummond names, once spoken with pride, became shrouded in sorrow. Their homes stood empty, their fortunes entangled in legal disputes and the slow decay of neglect. The city's social calendar, so recently filled with promise, was now marked by absences and silences. The Hemlock Wedding had become a wound that would not heal, a story that would not fade. Inspector Calder, for all his diligence, could do little more than record the facts. He filed his final report with a heavy heart, noting the unresolved questions, the lack of evidence, the disappearance of the only surviving witness. He walked the city's streets in the evenings, his footsteps echoing on the cobblestones, his thoughts turning over the case again and again. He wondered if he had missed something, a detail overlooked, a clue misunderstood. But the city offered no answers, only the cold comfort of routine and the slow passage of time. As the months slipped into years, the Hemlock Wedding passed from newsprint to folklore. Children dared each other to run past the McAllister townhouse at dusk, their voices hushed as they recounted the tale of the vanished bride. Lovers left sprigs of heather at the church gate, a silent tribute to a happiness lost. The story was told in whispers at firesides, in the corners of public houses, in the quiet moments before sleep. It became a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of envy, ambition, and secrets too heavy to bear. The city itself seemed changed by the events. The gas lights burned a little dimmer, the air felt colder, and the echo of bells lingered longer in the night. The Hemlock Wedding became a part of Edinburgh's identity, woven into the fabric of its history alongside tales of royal intrigue and ancient feuds. It was a story that belonged to everyone and no one, a mystery that resisted every attempt at resolution. For those who had known Fiona, the pain of her loss was sharpened by the uncertainty of her fate. Some held out hope that she had found peace in some distant place, that she had built a new life, far from the shadows of her past. Others believed she had been claimed by the same darkness that had taken her family, her absence a final act of surrender to grief. A few, their faith unshaken, lit candles in her memory each year on the anniversary of the wedding, their prayers rising like smoke into the cold Scottish air. The Hemlock Wedding left its mark on the city in other ways as well. The use of hemlock in medicine and gardens was quietly discouraged, its presence now a reminder of sorrow rather than healing. The tradition of the bride's special cup faded from fashion, replaced by simpler rituals less fraught with meaning. The city's appetite for gossip and scandal was, for a time, tempered by the memory of how quickly joy could turn to ash. Yet for all the pain and confusion, the story endured. It was retold in novels and plays, in poems and songs, each version adding new details, new motives, new suspects. The truth, whatever it had been, was lost beneath the weight of legend. The Hemlock Wedding became a mirror for the city's own fears and hopes, a story that could be shaped to fit any lesson, any warning, any dream. And so, as the years passed and the city changed, the memory of that day lingered, a day when the bells rang for joy and for mourning, when a bride walked into history and then vanished, leaving only questions behind. The years that followed the Hemlock Wedding were marked by a quiet reckoning in Edinburgh. The city, so often proud of its resilience, found itself changed in subtle ways. The tragedy had left a scar not only on the families involved, but on the very spirit of the place. The McAllister townhouse, once a beacon of hospitality, stood empty and shuttered, its windows gathering dust and its garden left to wildness. The Drummond estate, too, faded from the city's social memory, its gates rusting and its halls echoing with the footsteps of caretakers rather than laughter. The funerals, held in the days after the disaster, were somber affairs. The bells of St. Giles's tolled again and again, their mournful notes drifting over the rooftops and down the winds. Black-clad mourners moved in slow procession through the city's ancient streets, their faces drawn and pale, their eyes red from sleepless nights and weeping. The ministers spoke of fate and forgiveness, of the mysteries of providence, but their words seemed small against the enormity of the loss. 36 coffins, draped in tartan and heather, were lowered into the earth, each one a chapter closed, a future lost. The press, never far from the city's pulse, chronicled every detail. The Edinburgh Evening News ran daily columns recounting the events of the wedding, the investigation, and the bride's disappearance. Editorials speculated on motives, suspects, and the possibility of a curse. Some writers called for justice, others for compassion, but all agreed that the city would never be quite the same. The story spread beyond Scotland, carried by telegraph and train to London, Paris, and even New York, where readers marveled at the strangeness and sorrow of the tale. In the months that followed, suspicion lingered like a fog. Neighbors eyed each other warily. Old feuds were rekindled, and the city's appetite for gossip seemed insatiable. Theories multiplied. Some insisted the poison had been meant for the bride, others for the groom, still others for both families. A few whispered that the tragedy was the work of a jealous rival, a spurned lover, or a business enemy seeking revenge. The police, for all their efforts, could offer no answers. Inspector Calder's final report was a catalogue of questions, a record of evidence that led only to dead ends. The absence of Fiona McAllister became the final, unhealed wound. Her wedding dress, left draped over the church gate, was carefully collected and stored by the parish, but no one ever came to claim it. Some believed she had taken her own life, her grief too great to bear. Others imagined her living in exile, her name changed, her past buried beneath layers of new beginnings. A few, their voices hushed, wondered if she had been silenced by those who feared what she might reveal. The truth, like so much else in the story, was lost to time. The Hemlock Wedding became a part of Edinburgh's darker folklore. Children grew up hearing the tale, their imaginations fired by the image of the vanished bride and the silence that followed her. The story was told in whispers at bedtime, in warnings to the unwary, in the quiet moments before sleep when the city's ancient stones seemed to remember every sorrow. The McAllister townhouse became a place to be avoided, its shadow stretching long across the street at dusk. The Drummond estate, too, was said to be haunted by the sound of distant music and the echo of laughter that would never return. Writers and artists found inspiration in the tragedy. Novels and plays reimagined the events, each adding new details, new motives, new suspects. Painters captured the image of the bride's dress on the church gate, the empty townhouse, the mourners in procession. Poets wrote of love and loss, of joy turned to ash, of a city forever changed by a single night. The Hemlock Wedding became a symbol, a story that could be shaped to fit any lesson, any warning, any fear. Yet for all the retellings, the heart of the story remained unchanged. A day of joy transformed into a night of horror, a union meant to heal old wounds instead opening new ones. The city's sense of safety was shaken, its trust in tradition and ritual forever altered. The use of hemlock in medicine and gardens quietly faded, its name now spoken only in caution. The tradition of the bride's special cup was abandoned, replaced by simpler, safer customs. In the years that followed, the city rebuilt itself. New families moved into the old houses, new celebrations filled the calendar, and the memory of the Hemlock Wedding slowly receded into the background, yet it never vanished entirely. On certain nights when the wind rattled the windows and the bells of St. Giles's echoed through the mist, the story would rise again, as vivid and unsettling as ever. For those who lost loved ones, the pain never fully faded. Each anniversary brought fresh flowers to the graves, fresh tears to the eyes of those who remembered. The city, for all its resilience, carried the weight of the tragedy in ways both seen and unseen. The Hemlock Wedding became a lesson in the fragility of happiness, the unpredictability of fate, and the enduring power of unanswered questions. And so, the story endures. A haunting refrain in the city's long history, a reminder that even the brightest celebrations can be shadowed by darkness, that even the most joyful unions can end in silence. The Hemlock Wedding remains one of Scotland's most haunting unions, a day of joy turned to ash, and a bride whose absence became the final unanswered question. As the echoes of the Hemlock Wedding fade into the Edinburgh mist, the questions linger, unanswered, unsettling, and unforgettable. What do you make of this story, where joy and tragedy walked hand in hand through the heart of a city? Do you believe the truth was ever within reach? Or are some mysteries destined to remain unsolved, woven into the very stones of Edinburgh itself? We invite you to share your thoughts, your theories, and your own stories of local legend in the comments below. Let us know where you're listening from and how this tale resonates with you or your own community's history. Your voice is part of the living memory that keeps these stories alive, crossing borders and generations. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of Scotland's most haunting mysteries. Until next time, may you find light in the shadows, and may the stories of the past remind us all to cherish the fragile joys of the present.